G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Thanks for coming along. We're into session 24 of the book of Jeremiah. We're looking at chapter 35, verse 1 to chapter 36, verse 26, hopefully. Last session, we finished off with Zedekiah's violation of a covenant that he had made with the people. This wasn't one of God's covenants, it was simply a covenant that he made with the people, but he made it before God in the temple. And that was that he was going to release all the Hebrew slaves from bondage and he would give them their freedom. Now, this was at a time when Jerusalem was under siege by the Babylonians, so they couldn't do any work anyway. So why do we have to feed and clothe them? We might as well just let them free. Now, the Babylonians lifted the siege and they had to go and fight against Egypt, who had come to the aid of Judah. And as soon as the siege was lifted, Zedekiah reneged on the covenant he had made with the people regarding the freedom of the Hebrew slaves. He then had them brought back again under bondage. Now, this covenant was actually a solemn covenant made before God in the temple by passing through the halves of a sacrificed calf. And breaking this covenant profaned the name of God by forcing their fellow Jews to return into slavery. The result of this was that death to the covenant breakers. Zedekiah and the leaders of Israel Judah are to be turned over to the Babylonians, who had temporarily lifted the siege, but later returned to make the cities of Judah desolation. So that was the end of chapter 34. Now we're into chapter 35, and we're going to look at the Rechabites. This is a clan, a dynasty. We're going to look at these in 35 verses 1 to 19. Now, the disobedience of Jeremiah's generation, down in Judah there, is now offset in chapter 35 with the example of these Rechabites. It's a nomadic tribe known for its very rigorous restrictions prohibiting the use of wine, the construction of permanent dwellings, the sowing of seed, and the planting of vines. We'll see that shortly in Jeremiah. For 250 years, from the time of Jehu, back in 2 Kings 10:15 to the time of Jeremiah, where we are in Jeremiah 35 verses 8 to 10, the Rechabites remained steadfast in their adherence to these regulations. Now, we're going to look at this coming up section in three parts. We're going to have the symbolic action in verses 1 to 11, then the interpretation of the action in verses 12 to 17, and then the promise to the house of Rechab in verses 18 to 19. Symbolic action first up, and this is another symbolic action we see here. Verse 1, the word which came unto Jeremiah from Jehovah in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Now, we have the date showing that this occurred during the reign of Jehoiakim. When did he reign? He was 609 to 598 BC. No specific year is given, but because it was in the reign of Jehoiakim, the events of chapter 35, where we are now, actually occurred before the events of chapter 34. Remember, Jeremiah doesn't write in chronological order. So this tells us that chapters 35 and 36 actually precede chapter 32 to 34. All right? Chronologically speaking, 35 and 36 is actually before 32 to 34. In verse 2 of chapter 35, we have the specific command given to Jeremiah. And God says to him, go unto the house of the Rechabites and speak unto them and bring them into the house of Jehovah, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. So Jeremiah was to go to the house of the Rechabites, and I said that the Rechabites were a dynastic type house that actually mentioned in verses 2, 3, 5, and 18. Now, who were they? They were actually a branch of the Kenites, and the Kenites, right back in Genesis, the Kenites were the family of Jethro, and Jethro is the father-in-law of Moses. So cast your mind back into Genesis. Moses had lived among them for 40 years between his time in Egypt and the Exodus. And this is mentioned in Judges 1:16, Judges 4:11 and 17, and Judges 5:24, along with 1 Samuel 15:6 and 1 Chronicles 2 verse 55. Now, these descendants are of the same family of the Kenites among whom Moses lived and from whom Moses' wife came. Jeremiah was commanded to go to them and speak to them and bring them into the house of Jehovah, meaning he's to bring them into the compound of the temple compound, into one of the chambers. The temple compound was comprised of various chambers for various purposes. You can see them in 1 Kings 6:5 and 1 Chronicles 28:12. 1 Kings 6:5, 1 Chronicles 28:12. So Jeremiah was to bring him in and offer the Rechabites some wine to drink. And in verses 3-5, he carried out the command. In verse 3 is the gathering of the house of the Rechabites. And he says, "Then I took Jezaniah, the son of Jeremiah, the son of Habazziniah, and his brethren, and all his sons, and the whole house of the Rechabites." So at this point in time, Jezaniah was apparently the present leader of the community, and his brethren, meaning the rest of the house of the Rechabites, Jeremiah took these. In verse 4, they're now brought into the temple compound. "I brought them into the house of Jehovah, into the chamber of the sons of Hanan, the son of Igdalah, the man of God, which was by the chamber of the princes, which was above the chamber of Messiah, the son of Shallum, the keeper of the threshold." Okay, now this Hanan, we're told, was the son of Igdaliah. Now, we don't know anything about this Igdaliah except this one statement we see here, which is made about him. It says that he was the man of God. So this expression was often the honorable title of a prophet. So Igdaliah, the father of Hanan, whose chamber Jeremiah used, was a prophet. So this shows us that many others served as prophets before God, but they didn't write anything down because there's only a few writing prophets. We know that he's a prophet because the expression the man of God was used in the Old Testament as an honorable title of a prophet. And it's used in Deuteronomy 33:1, 1 Samuel 2:27, 1 Kings 12:22, 2 Kings 1:9-13, and 4:21-22. Okay, now it's the chamber of the sons of Hanan that was used. And this chamber was near the chamber of the princes, which was near the chamber of Messiah, who was the father of Zephaniah the priest. Just a little bit of history, that's all. We read about Zephaniah the priest earlier on. He was mentioned back in Jeremiah 21 and Jeremiah 29. Now, Messiah was the son of Shallum, who was the keeper of the threshold. What does that mean? Well, the keeper of the threshold was in charge of the funds which were designated for repairing the temple and the temple compound. And that's according to 2 Kings 12, verses 9-10. 2 Kings 12, 9-10. And there are always three such officials. And this is known from 2 Kings 25:18. And also we'll see it later on in Jeremiah 52, verse 24, where these three officials were, along with the princes, were singled out by the Babylonians for judgment. Now, in obedience to God's command to Jeremiah, the entire house of the Rechabites was brought into the temple compound. And further on, in keeping with God's command, in verse 5, they were now offered wine. "And I set before the sons of the house of the Rechabites bowls full of wine and cups." So the word bowls here refers to large bowls. In addition to these large bowls filled with wine, there are also some cups, and the cups will be used to fetch the wine out of the bowls and then used for the purpose of drinking. "And I said to them," Jeremiah said unto them, "Drink ye the wine." Now, up to this point, the command of God has been kept in its entirety. Okay, Jeremiah's done everything he's asked to do. However, while Jeremiah was commanded to offer the wine, the Rechabites were not commanded by God to drink it. Remember, this is an illustration for, well, it's an illustration for Judah we're going to see here. In verses 6 to 11, we have the refusal of the Rechabites. In verses 6 to 7, the reason for the refusal is because of the vow of the Rechabites. So in verse 6, they refused to drink the wine, but they said, "We will drink no wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us." So the reason they wouldn't drink wine was because Jonadab, the son of Rechab, commanded us. So who is this Jonadab? Jonadab. Jonadab is mentioned back in 2 Kings 10, verses 15 to 24. Now, he wasn't a Jew. Rechabites weren't Jews, but he played a role in Jewish politics in the northern kingdom of Israel. Jonadab, we're told in 2 Kings 10, 15 to 24, sided with Jehu, the king in Israel, against the house of eventually one of the kings of Israel, against the house of Ahab and against the worship of Baal. He aided Jehu to do away with the house of Ahab, and even more so, to do away with the worship of Baal. Now this guy wasn't a Jew. Apparently, the experience of Jonadab centuries earlier in the time of Jehu, when dealing with these events with Baal and with the worship of Baal, caused him to dislike city living. He felt that living in the city, one tended to be corrupted, and he felt that those who lived in the cities tended to worship Baal. Therefore, what he did was he instituted the vow of the Rechabites, recorded in the second part of verse 6 and verse 7. You shall drink, this is the vow, you shall drink no wine, neither you nor your sons forever. Neither shall you build houses, nor sow seed, nor plant vineyard, nor have any. But all your days you shall dwell in tents, that you may live many days in the land wherein you sojourn. So there are 5 elements to the Rechabite vow. First of all, there was the abstinence from wine, the abstinence from building permanent living quarters, the abstinence from farming, the abstinence from planting vineyards, and the command to live a nomadic life. They were to dwell in tents. Now, some people who like to use this passage against the drinking of alcoholic beverages should note that it is not the entirety of the vow. It was not simply a prohibition against drinking wine. It also included not building houses or sowing seed or planting vineyards, or to live in tents, not homes, having a nomadic existence. So their sustenance here was provided by their taking care of herds and flocks. So if a person wants to use the Rechabite vow as a reason for not command against drinking alcohol, well, they got to do the rest of the stuff as well. They should live in tents and be shepherds. That's not going to happen. Now in verse 7, the second part of verse 7, Jonadab gave the reasons for this 5-part vow: that you may live many days in the land in which you sojourn. And the word sojourn here is the Hebrew word gerim, which basically means resident aliens. So the reason was that they might live many years as resident aliens in the land. Now, they would never become full citizens, but they would maintain their own separate nationality as Kenites and their own Rechabite culture. They remained as resident aliens living amongst the Jewish people. And by this time, this vow had been kept for 2.5 centuries, 250 years. From the time this vow was given to the time that Jeremiah created this incident among the Rechabites, 250 years had passed, and they were faithful to this vow. In verses 8 to 10 is the obedience to the vow. Verse 8 says, and we have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he charged us, to drink no wine all our days, we, our wives, our sons, or our daughters, nor to build houses for us to dwell in. Neither have we vineyard, nor field, nor seed, but we have dwelt in tents and have obeyed and done according to all that Jonadab our father commanded us. They obeyed the voice of Jonadab and consistently maintained their nomadic conditions of living. They were very faithful in this realm. Now, if all that is true, well, why are they suddenly found in Jerusalem then? If they're nomadic, why are they in Jerusalem? Well, chapter 35, verse 11 tells us this. It came to pass when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up into the land, that we said, come and let us go to Jerusalem for fear of the army of the Chaldeans and for fear of the army of the Syrians. So we dwell at Jerusalem. So it says when Nebuchadnezzar came into the land, this is more than likely a reference to the first invasion of 606, 605 BC. They entered Jerusalem temporarily, but only for the sake of their safety. They feared the army of the Chaldeans and the Syrians. Syrians are the Arameans. So not only did the Chaldeans attack in the first war against Israel, but also so did the Syrians. We see that in 2 Kings 24 verses 1 to 2. 2 Kings 24, 1 to 2. Now, so the reason why they now found themselves in the city was because of fear of the armies outside of the surrounding countryside. This may have to do with the first or second invasion, I'm not quite sure. It can't be referring to the third invasion because they took the place before that time. So their intent was only to dwell in Jerusalem temporarily. And that was for the sake of their own safety. Now, what's the interpretation of this symbolic action? We find this in verses 12 to 17. In verse 12, then came the word of Jehovah unto Jeremiah, saying, and so the word now comes to him for the purpose of explaining the symbolic action. In verse 13, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, go and say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction to hearken to my words, says Jehovah. So the recipients of the lesson of the Rechabites are the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And the rhetorical question is, will you not receive instruction to listen to my words? Now, the Rechabites are not only an object lesson for Judah, but their ability to remain constant and faithful condemns Judah and King Jehoiakim for their lack of constancy, obedience, and faithfulness. They're to learn a lesson from the faithfulness of the Rechabites, because the faithfulness of the Rechabites is going to be contrasted with the unfaithfulness of Judah. And the thing to note here is that Jeremiah at no time is commending them for their nomadic lifestyle. He's commending them for their faithfulness. In fact, under the Mosaic law, it could not be like this, because the Mosaic law commanded Jews to own their own vineyards and to sow in the land. So if they were Jews, they'd be breaking Mosaic law. However, Rechabites were not Jews. They were not under the Mosaic law, and so we're not under the same obligations as the Jews. Now, Jeremiah will not commend them for the nomadic lifestyle of the Rechabites. Rather, what he's doing is he's commending them, or he's commending their obedience and their faithfulness to a vow at this point. In verses 14 to 15, we have the contrast between the Rechabites and the men of Judah. In the first part of verse 14 is the faithfulness of the Rechabites. The words of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, that he commanded his sons not to drink wine are performed. And unto this day they drink none, for they obey their father's commandment. It was obedience to the vow of their forefather that had led the Rechabites to refuse the wine offered by Jeremiah. To argue that such obedience is humanly impossible flies right in the face of what these tent-dwelling aliens have been able to demonstrate. These descendants of Jonadab, son of Rechab, have faithfully observed a command for well over 250 years in the days of the reign of Ahab, terrible king. And in contrast, in the second part of verse 14 and verse 15 is the unfaithfulness of Judah. In verse 14, Judah rejected the prophets. Jeremiah writes, but I have spoken unto you, this is God, I have spoken unto you, rising up early and speaking. And again, this is a phrase used for the prophetic voice. And again, again and again, got the hiccups again. Jehovah had spoken to his people through the prophetic voice, yet you have not hearkened unto me. In verse 15, he explains what the message of the prophets had been rejected were. I have sent also unto you all my servants the prophets, rising up early and sending them. Again, this is a symbol of the prophetic voice, rising up early, sending them. And the message was, return you now every man from his evil ways. Here again, we have the word shuv, return. They should amend their doings and should not go after other gods. There are three basic points to this message. First of all, return every man from his evil ways. Turn back to God. Second, amend his doings. Stop doing what you're doing. And third, do not go after other gods to serve them. Put aside idolatry. Go back to the one true God. Had they obeyed, they would have been allowed to live peacefully in their own land. And then in the second part of verse 15, is a rejection of the prophetic word. But you have not inclined your ear, nor hearkened unto me, nor listened unto me. And in verses 16 to 17 is a judgment upon Judah. Verse 16 elaborates on the basis of the judgment that would follow. For as much as the sons of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, have performed the commandment of their father, which he commanded them. So what we see here is the faithfulness of the Rechabites is now contrasted to the unfaithfulness of Judah, and their disobedience became the basis of the judgment. But this people has not hearkened unto me. That means Judah, Jehoiakim, and Judah. The judgment is now revealed in verse 17. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will bring upon Judah and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem all the evil that I have pronounced against them, because I have spoken unto them, but they have not heard. And I have called unto them, but they have not answered. The judgment against Judah and Jerusalem was brought forth by another word of the Lord, who declared that the people of Judah and all the citizens of Jerusalem would experience the great disaster that he had pronounced against them. The calamity that God prophesied through Jeremiah will now take place. And this declaration now summarizes all that Jeremiah had prophesied previously. The passage ends with a repetition of the reason for the divine judgments. Jehovah had spoken to his people, yet they did not hear. God has called, but they have not answered. And now we see the promise to the Rechabites because of their faithfulness. Verse 18 gives the basis of this promise, which is their obedience to a vow. Jeremiah said unto the house of the Rechabites, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have obeyed the commandment of Jonadab your father, and kept all his precepts, and done according unto all that he commanded you. So now in verse 19, is the blessing. Therefore, and again, we always need to look what the word therefore is there for. And in this case, it is there because of verse 18. Considering their faithfulness to a vow that we see back in verse 18, therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not want a man to stand before me forever. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, the expression shall not want in Hebrew literally means will not be cut off. This means that Jonadab will always have descendants. So at no point in history will there be a time when the descendants of Jonadab will be totally cut off. So this means that somewhere in our age today, somewhere in the world, are descendants of Jonadab. He'll not be cut off. He'll always have descendants. The phrase to stand before Jehovah, this pictures a servant waiting to do the bidding of his master, and it is frequently used of men who served God as priests. And you can check that out in Deuteronomy 10, verse 8, Deuteronomy 18, verse 5 and 7, 1 Kings 8, 11, 2 Chronicles 29, 11. What exactly, in the light of all of this, is the content of the promise he made? There are two possibilities for interpreting this verse. First of all, the house of the Rechabites will always have descendants, and they'll be among the elect of God. Jonadab will always have descendants, and there'll also be men who are spiritually saved. Wherever the descendants of the Rechabites may be, there will always be believers among them. And second, members of the house of the Rechabites will be among the priests in the millennial kingdom. Now, why do we say this? Because even though they're not Jews, because according to Isaiah 66, verses 18 to 21, we read that in the kingdom, not only will there be Jewish priests, but there will be also Gentile priests. Perhaps members of the house of the Rechabites will be among these Gentile priests. Now, the Mishnah has one explanation for the fulfillment of these prophecies. One tractate, Tannahite 45, says, the children of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, had a fixed day of the year for bringing wood to the altar of the temple. And so according to the Mishnah, when the temple was rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity, the Rechabites were given a fixed day of the year in which they were responsible for bringing the wood for the service of the temple, the burning of the sacrifices. It's possible to some extent that is the fulfillment of this verse, although that can hardly be the complete fulfillment of it. Now, this chapter makes the case that obedience, even if it is only obedience to a human command, is possible. If Judah thinks it's too hard to be faithful to what God has instructed them, then how come these people have remained faithful to the commands of a great-great-great-grandfather whose commands were merely about earthly things and not about heavenly things? Surely it's also possible to observe God's instructions. For the faithfulness of these people to their earthly command shows it is more than possible to be obedient to a heavenly command. Now we're going to see the story of the scroll. We're getting into chapter 36. We're going to see the writing of the first scroll in verses 1 to 4. Came to pass in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, that this word came unto Jeremiah from Jehovah, saying. So verse 1 gives us the date. It was the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the Jewish month of Nisan, in 604 to 605 BC. And at this time, Jeremiah had been a prophet for 23 years, 627 to 604. On your slide, if you have it there, I put 25. When I did the calculations, it's 23. The specific date is in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And among the significant things that happened in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, first of all, we had the Battle of Carchemish took place. This is where the Egyptians and the Assyrians were defeated by the Babylonians. The Babylonians then became the dominant world power as a result. By 604 BC, this king of the Babylonian Empire was now threatening Judah, as the Babylonian armies were now in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So this is the first thing. Second thing that happened in this year, it was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who was the first king of the times of the Gentiles. Times of the Gentiles, Jesus speaks about them down in the Gospels. Third, Jeremiah announced the 70 years of captivity in Jeremiah 25, which was in this year. Fourth, Jeremiah began to record his prophecies in writing, which we're going to see in this chapter. In verses 2 to 3, he's given the command to record these prophecies. In verse 2, we're told about the writing. Take you a roll of a book and write therein all the words that I have spoken unto you against Israel and against Judah, and against all the nations from the day I spoke unto you, from the days of Josiah, even unto this day. Take you a roll of a book. So he was to take the scroll of a book. Hebrew phrase for a roll of a book in here is unusual insofar as it is found elsewhere, only in Psalm 40 verse 8 and Ezekiel 2:9. It uses the Hebrew term Megillat Sefer. A more normal expression for scroll would be Megillah. Anyway, there's a bit of Hebrew. Now, Jeremiah is to write all the words that God has spoken to him, and the content is to be the words that the prophet has seen and spoken against Israel, against Judah, and against all the nations. So this book or scroll comprised the first and second sections and elements of the third section, which we haven't studied yet, but we're getting there. So this is going to be the first and second sections. The duration of the written content included everything that was prophesied from the days of Josiah to the present day, which was the 4th year of Jehoiakim. It was around 23 years. Now, in verse 3 is the purpose of this writing. It may be that the house of Judah will hear all the evil which I purpose to do unto them, that they may return every man from his evil way, that I may forgive their iniquity and their sin. The Israelites will hear what God intends to do, and they'll have a permanent written record. It's going to be written in this scroll now. Up to now, the people only possessed their memories of a vocal message. They'd heard what Jeremiah said, but they had to rely on their memories. However, from this point on, they'll possess a written message. And the goal that God wished to reach was for every man to turn from his evil way, turn back to God. Again, we have the word shuv, which is return. Remember, shuv is Jeremiah's favorite word in his book. And the result would be that God would forgive their iniquity and their sin. Now, we already know that while the judgment could not be alleviated because of the sins of Manasseh, it could be delayed. And Jehovah made sure to remind his people of this truth. We can delay the coming judgment if you turn back to me. Now, in verse 4 is Jeremiah's obedience. Then Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of Jehovah, which he had spoken unto him upon a roll of a book. So Jeremiah now called his scribe Baruch, the son of Neriah. Remember, we first read of him back in chapter 32, verses 12 to 15. Who is he? Well, he was the brother of Seraiah, who was a quartermaster to King Zedekiah, according to Jeremiah 51, verse 59. Now, the process of this recording, according to verse 4, first of all, Baruch would write from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words that Jehovah had spoken unto him in this roll. All the words originated with God. And the emphasis here is not just on ideas or concepts or principles. The emphasis here is upon the very words in their original context. The words themselves originated with God. God gives the message to the prophet, which the prophet in turn dictates to Baruch, which he then writes down. The second thing we see here is that God would reveal his words to his prophet. And in this case, it was the prophet Jeremiah. Third, the prophet would speak the words of God to his scribe. Fourth, the scribe recorded the words of God in this scroll. Now, not all prophets had scribes. Jeremiah had Baruch to write his words. Sometimes a prophet wrote for himself. Paul used a scribe in more than one of his letters, the Apostle Paul. So with the words that are recorded now in verses 5 to 10, we now come to a section which deals with the reading of the first scroll. This is in 5 to 10. Now, in verses 5 to 7, Jeremiah issues a command to Baruch. The command is essentially for Baruch to read the scroll. In verse 5, and Jeremiah commanded Baruch, saying, I am shut up. I cannot go into the house of Jehovah. So this is the reason why Baruch must read the scroll and not Jeremiah himself. Why? Because Jeremiah was shut up. Now, it doesn't mean that Jeremiah was imprisoned. He was not imprisoned in the days of Jehoiakim, but later on in the days of Zedekiah, he was imprisoned. He's not imprisoned, but what is happening is that he is being hindered from entering the temple compound for one reason or the other. You know, the exact reason is unknown, but it may be based on his temple sermons back in chapter 7, verses 1 to 15, or the events of chapter 19, verse 1 to chapter 20, verse 6. So that's 19:1 to 20, verse 6, or his temple sermon back in chapter 7, verses 1 to 15. Both of them had effects upon the people and the leadership. After the temple sermon, Jeremiah was probably prohibited from entering the temple compound, and since he was prohibited, Baruch now must read the scroll for him. And the result of Jeremiah being shut up was that he could not enter the house of Jehovah. So the command to read was given to Baruch in verse 6. Therefore, go you and read in the roll which you have written from my mouth the words of Jehovah in the ears of the people in Jehovah's house upon the fast day. And also you shall read them in the ears of all Judah that come out of their cities. Okay, so notice here he wrote down the words of Jehovah. He is to read the scroll not on any old day, but during a very special occasion in the ears of the people in Jehovah's house upon the fast day. He was to read the scroll on the day of fasting. Now, this is a pretty shrewd strategy here. For public fasts were proclaimed during times of war, famine, or physical threat to the community. So the people would appear at the house of God wearing sackcloth with ashes sprinkled on their heads as a sign of public lamentation. Now, as a result of what he says, we know that the actual reading took place in the 9th month of the 5th year, which is clearly stated in verse 9. However, the writing itself took place a year earlier, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. From the time Baruch was ordered to read in verse 6 until he actually did it, approximately 1 year had now passed. A fast day was probably called in remembrance of when Jerusalem fell the first time in 606 to 605 BC, but more likely, knowing the time that we're in here at this time with the siege going on, this fast was called on the year that the Philistines were defeated by the Babylonians, which meant that Jerusalem was next on the agenda. Now, this defeat occurred during the second invasion that came in the days of Jehoiakim in 597 BC. As a result of the king's rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, the audience was not limited to the residents of Jerusalem, but included people from all over Judah. And the purpose for the reading is given in verse 7. It may be they'll present their supplication before Jehovah and will return everyone from his evil way. For great is the anger and the wrath that Jehovah had pronounced against this people. Again, we see here the word shuv is used, and the reasons are given as great as the anger and the wrath that God has against his people. Because of the great wrath and the anger of Jehovah, it's important that the people be aware of it and are given the opportunity to repent. So it's important that they repent and so delay the judgment. Now, verses 8 to 10 show that a year later, Jeremiah's command was fulfilled. Verse 8 describes Baruch's obedience, which resulted in the reading. And Baruch the son of Neriah did according to all that Jeremiah the prophet commanded him, reading in the book of the words of Jehovah in Jehovah's house. So Baruch read the scroll publicly in the temple compound. In verses 9 to 10, we have the occasions for the reading. Verse 9 says, "Now it came to pass in the 5th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, in the 9th month, that all the people in Jerusalem and all the people that came from the cities of Judah unto Jerusalem proclaimed a fast before Jehovah." It was proclaimed a fast day. It was the 9th month of the 5th year. It was the year 604, 603 BC. It was winter time, as we shall see later. So because the occasion of the gathering was a fast day, the entire population of Judah came to the temple compound. Again, the fast, as we saw, the fast could have been declared for 2 reasons: to remember the fall of Jerusalem in 606, 605, and the first deportation, or because in this month, the Babylonians took the city of Ashkelon from the Philippines, not the Philippines, the Philistines, which meant that Jerusalem was next. Their end was coming. We don't know the exact purpose of the fast, but whatever it was, a fast was called as a result of a specific emergency, and it was on this occasion that the scroll was read. In verse 10 is the place of the reading. Then read Baruch in the book the words of Jeremiah in the house of Jehovah in the chamber of Gemariah the son of Shaphan. Now, Shaphan was a good and faithful priest in the days of good King Josiah. You can see that in 2 Kings 22, verse 3. The scribe in the upper court of the entry of the new gate of Jehovah's house in the ears of all the people. That's where he read it. Now, Shaphan brought up 3 godly sons. They were spiritual men who were friends and protectors of Jeremiah. First, we had Jehoiakim in Jeremiah 26:24. He was the father of Gedaliah. Oh, these are in the next page. Okay. Okay. Now, we see here that Shaphan was a scribe, and this is probably the reason why Baruch chose this particular chamber to read the scroll, because it says in the upper court of the entry of the new gate, Jehovah's house, in the ears of all the people. So not only did this upper chamber or this chamber belong to Shaphan, but it's also described as having been located in the upper court. Now, by choosing this room, Baruch was now in a position overlooking the people gathered in the courtyards, and he could be seen and heard by everyone. So this upper court lay at the entry of the new gate of Jehovah's house, which we saw back in Jeremiah 26, verse 10. So having done this, we see the, no, hang on. I'll just give you a quick burst on who these guys are. We had Jehoiakim, Jeremiah 26:24, father of Gedaliah. We'll read about him in chapter 39. Elasah, who bore the message for Jeremiah to the exiles. That was back in 29, verse 3. Shaphan, his 3rd son, Gemariah, he'll be introduced shortly. Here, it's only important to mention that Gemariah had a son named Micaiah, who also lived a life of obedience to Jehovah. So Shaphan had 3 sons, 2 grandsons, all of whom were Jeremiah's friends and protectors. Okay. Let's keep going. Now we see the response of the princes of Judah in verses 11 to 19. Verses 11 to 13, we have the report of Micaiah. Micaiah heard all the words Baruch read out of the scroll that contained the words of Jehovah in verse 11. It says, when Micaiah, the son of Gemariah, the son of Shaphan, had heard out of the book all the words of Jehovah. So remember, he's the son of Gemariah, who was the son of Shaphan. So Micaiah was a grandson of Shaphan, the faithful priest of Josiah, who raised this spiritual family. And in verse 12, he went down into the king's house, into the scribe's chamber, and lo, all the princes were sitting there, to wit, Elishama the scribe, Delaiah the son of Shemaiah, and Elnathan the son of Akbor, and Gemariah the son of Shaphan, Zedekiah the son of Hananiah, and all the princes. So these are the princes of Judah to whom he now reported. The place was the king's house. The scribe's chamber was in the king's palace. And these princes were government officials who were meeting for business in the chamber of the scribe. And among them were several men who were friendly to Jeremiah. And they included Elishama, the scribe, who was the grandfather of Ishmael, back in 2 Kings 25, verse 25. You see it also in Jeremiah 41:14. This is Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, will cause grief for Jeremiah after the fall of Jerusalem, and he's actually going to kill Gedaliah, his cousin. So he's a nice chap, this one. Then we have Delaiah, the son of Shemaiah. Don't know much about him. Elnathan, the son of Akbor. Akbor we see back in 2 Kings 22, verse 12. Elnathan experienced what had happened to the prophet Uriah at the hand of Jehoiakim in Jeremiah 26, 22 to 23. And as a result of his experiences over the Uriah incident, Elnathan, the son of Akbor, will be very careful in the way he protects Jeremiah. If he's the same Elnathan mentioned in 2 Kings 24:8, then he was King Jehoiakim's father-in-law, as if he's the same guy. Now, Gemariah, the son of Shaphan, he was the father of Micaiah, who turned the report in to begin with. And then we had Zedekiah, the son of Hananiah. Now, these were the 5 princes. Their fathers had served Josiah, the father of Jehoiakim, and they also served Jehoiakim. And they all seemed to be faithful men who served the Lord. In verse 13, we're told the report to the princes. Micaiah declared to them all the words that he had heard when Baruch read the book in the ears of the people. And then we see in verses 14 to 19 is the specific response. In verse 14, we have the fetching of Baruch. Now they send a messenger, and the messenger is, therefore, all the princes sent Jehudi, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Shelemiah, the son of Cushi, unto Baruch, saying, take in thy hand the roll wherein thou hast read in the ears of the people, and come. So Baruch, the son of Neriah, took the roll in his hand and came unto them. Moreover, Baruch, in keeping with what he must do, obeys the order of the princes. He takes the roll in his hand. He now comes down to them. But in verse 15, he reads the scroll before the princes. And they said unto him, sit down now and read it in our ears. So he offered a seat in their presence and read it in their ears. This was the second time the scroll was now read. First time he read the scroll was in the temple compound. This is the second time before the princes. In verse 16 is a response to the princes. It came to pass when they had heard all the words, they turned in fear one toward another and said unto Baruch, we will surely tell the king of all these words. So the officials understood that the content of the scroll was so important, it had to be presented to the king. The prophecies were terrifying. That's what they were worried about. However, to make sure the prophecies had indeed come from Jeremiah and not from Baruch himself, we see in verses 17 to 18, the officials now ask for information regarding the background, the recording of the words. And we see the request in verse 17. They asked Baruch, saying, tell us now, how did you write all these words at his mouth? What they must know is whether Baruch has done this on his own initiative, or perhaps these are simply a collection of old messages from the prophet. Surely there is little that is new in this scroll, for Jeremiah has been saying the same things for some 23 years of his ministry. And verse 18 details of Baruch's answer. Then Baruch answered them, he pronounced all these words unto me with his mouth, and I wrote them with ink in the book. So the importance of this verse should be missed here, because it affirms the verbal inspiration of Scripture. Jeremiah had dictated each and every word that he had received from the Lord to Baruch, and Baruch faithfully wrote down each of these words. Now, the princes, as there was their duty, must report to King Jehoiakim. And in verse 19, the officials issued a warning to Baruch and Jeremiah. Then said the princes unto Baruch, go, hide you and Jeremiah, and let no man know where you are. So even though the officials were duty bound to report all that they had heard to the king, but because they knew Jehoiakim's nature, they issued a warning to Baruch and Jeremiah. The background to this warning is the incident involving Uriah the prophet, who lost his life in Jeremiah 26:20-23. These faithful government officials had learned the lesson well. Although they were involved in bringing Uriah back from Egypt, they did not approve of his execution. And now they wanted to make sure that Jeremiah and Baruch would not suffer the same fate as Uriah. Now, verses 20-26, we see the destruction of the first scroll. In verse 20, in accordance with what they said they'd do, the princes report to Jehoiakim. They went into the king, into the court, but they'd laid up the roll in the chamber of Elishama the scribe, and they told all the words in the ears of the king. So before going into the king, what they did was they hid the roll or the scroll in the chamber of Elishama the scribe. They had respect for Jeremiah's words, and they were concerned about the safety of the scroll. Having put the scroll away, they told all the words of the scroll in the ears of the king, as it was their loyal duty the princes demanded. Up to now, done nothing wrong. However, Jehoiakim was not like his father, good King Josiah. Jehoiakim was of a different nature altogether. In verse 21, so the king sent Jehudi to fetch the roll. He took it out of the chamber of Elishama the scribe, and Jehudi read it in the ears of the king and in the ears of all the princes that stood beside the king. So he ordered the fetching of this scroll. He sends Jehudi, same man he sent to bring Baruch, must be the messenger. He's obviously a messenger in the royal house. So he brings the scroll from the chamber of Elishama the scribe, and he brings it back to Jehoiakim. And then Jehudi read the scroll to the king in verse 21. He read it in the ears of the king and in the ears of all the princes that stood beside the king. Now, in this instance, he also became the official reader of the scroll. So this is now the third reading of this scroll. First, the first here he read it in the ears of the king. Second, in the ears of all the princes that stood before the king. And this included the princes that heard it in the second reading when Baruch read it probably to those 5 princes. So now some other princes are here present who were not there before. So these other princes were not necessarily Jeremiah's friends. So for a third time that day, the scroll is now read in its entirety. And with the scrolls being read, verses 22-25 is a burning of the scroll. In verse 22, we have the opportunity for the burning. Now the king was sitting in the winter house in the 9th month, and there was a fire and a brazier burning before him. So why is he in the winter house? Well, because it's the 9th month and it was a winter time. And Jerusalem's winters are cold because the city is about 3,000 feet above sea level, just under 1,000 meters above sea level. And this room might have a southern exposure to get a little bit of warmth from the sun, possibly on the first floor of a 2-story building, and there'd be a hollow in the floor where you'd have the brazier made of metal or ceramic, a bit of a fire pot. So the fire was burning in the fireplace before them, and that provided now the opportunity for verse 23. Came to pass when Jehudi had read 3 or 4 leaves, that the king cut it with a penknife and cast it into the fire that was in the brazier, until all the roll was consumed in the fire that was in the brazier. Now, Jehudi finished reading 3 or 4 leaves, literally doors. The scroll was written in vertical columns of text. And when 3 or 4 columns were read, the king then took a penknife and cut it. Hebrew word for penknife literally means the knife of a scribe. It was a knife that was used by scribes for the purpose of cutting papyri in preparation for writing. And so he uses it here to cut off the 3 or 4 leaves which had just been read from Jeremiah's scroll, and then he threw them into the fireplace until the entire scroll was consumed in the fire. In verse 24, and they were not afraid, nor rent their garments, neither the king nor any of his servants that heard all these words. So Jehoiakim is in contrast with his godly father Josiah, who tore his garments when the newly discovered book of the law was read to him back in 2 Kings 22, verses 11 to 20. Jehoiakim and his servants refused to repent as the scroll demanded. It says they're not afraid, and they didn't bother to tear their garments when they heard these words. So neither the king nor his servants turned away from their sin. 3 of the 5 princes who heard the second reading pleaded with Jehoiakim not to destroy the scroll in verse 25. Moreover, Elnathan and Delaiah and Gemariah had made intercession to the king that he would not burn the roll, but he would not hear them. So these 3 made intercession that he wouldn't burn the scroll, but he refused to listen to them. And so what we have here, we have a division among the leaders about the respect that should be shown to this word of God. And the last slide, to make matters worse, after having destroyed the scroll 3 or 4 columns at a time, verse 26, after having it read, after reading it, rather than repenting of his sin and leading the nation in following suit, Jehoiakim now decided to also destroy its author and his scribe. So in verse 26, he issued orders for the arrest of Jeremiah and Baruch and sent 3 officers to arrest them. King commanded Jeremiah, the king's son, and Seraiah, the son of Azriel, and Shelemiah, the son of Abdil, to take Baruch the scribe and Jeremiah the prophet, but Jehovah hid them. So these 3 men were sent to arrest them, arrest these 2 men, Baruch and Jeremiah the prophet, but the arrest never materialized. Why? Because Jehovah God hid them. So once again, we see here that God kept his promise to Jeremiah that his life would be secure. He would not die, and he would die of natural causes. He would not die a martyr's death. That is your lot for today. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.